It is 1940. Europe is falling. France has surrendered. British forces are trapped at Dunkirk facing annihilation. And a 65-year-old man who has been dismissed as a warmonger and a failure is suddenly called to lead a nation facing extinction. For 25 years, Winston Churchill warned about the rising darkness in Germany. For 25 years, no one listened. They called him paranoid. They called him obsessed. They said he was living in the past, clinging to outdated notions of power and empire. And then the darkness came exactly as he had predicted. And suddenly, the man nobody wanted was the only man the nation needed. Tonight we unravel the life of Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill, the boy born in a palace who felt like an orphan, the young soldier who transformed himself into a legend through sheer force of will, the politician whose ambitions nearly destroyed him, the man who became the voice that saved Western civilization from the abyss. How did a man of such relentless ambition become a leader willing to sacrifice everything for his nation? Why did the man who dominated his age choose to lead when most leaders would have accepted defeat? And what was it about Churchill that made ordinary Britons stand in the rubble of their bombed-out cities and find reasons to keep fighting? The man who died in 1965 changed the 20th century forever. His speeches still echo. His warnings still resonate. Every act of resistance against tyranny since has followed the path he carved. In tonight's episode, we'll trace how a restless boy from Blenheim Palace became the bulldog spirit of an entire nation. We'll discover why he was dismissed as a failure until the moment he became essential. We'll witness how his greatest gift, the power of words, transformed despair into determination. And we'll understand how one man's conviction that civilization was worth fighting for gave millions of people reasons to endure the unendurable. Before we begin, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It really helps others discover these explorations of history. And let us know in the comments which historical figures you'd like us to explore next. Now settle in as we begin the journey through the life of Winston Churchill, the man who proved that destiny belongs to those willing to seize it, even when the world has given up hope. This is the bedtime biography of Winston Churchill. The boy was born on the 31st of October in the year of our Lord, 1874. But the actual date of his arrival into the world would shift in Churchill's own mind throughout his life. He would tell people he was born on the 30th of November, as if he could not bear to be associated with the ordinariness of October. Even as an infant, it seems, he was revising the narrative of his own existence, adjusting facts to better suit the legend he was already constructing in his imagination. Blenheim Palace was not a home in the way that ordinary people understand homes. It was a temple to British power built by John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough, as a monument to his own military genius. The palace contained over 200 rooms. Its grounds sprawled across acres of meticulously maintained gardens. It was the kind of place where greatness seemed to hang in the very air, settling into the stone and the furnishings, waiting to transfer itself to whoever was born within its walls. Young Winston arrived into this world of overwhelming grandeur and discovered almost immediately that grandeur and affection were not the same thing. His father was Lord Randolph Churchill, a man of brilliant intellect and considerable political ambition. But Lord Randolph possessed little warmth, little patience for the ordinary needs of childhood. He saw in his son a creature that needed to be molded into shape, tested to see if he possessed the steel necessary for greatness. His mother, Jenny Jerome, was an American heiress. a woman of beauty and charm who moved through society like someone accustomed to being admired. She had married into the British aristocracy and now inhabited a world of balls and social engagements that occupied most of her attention. Young Winston learned early that in a household where attention was the rarest commodity, one must fight to obtain it. He was sent away to school, as boys of his class were, and there he encountered the first of many institutions designed to break the spirit in the name of building character. The schoolyard was a place of cold stone corridors and colder human hearts. Churchill was small for his age, awkward in his movements, seemingly designed by nature to be the target of every cruel impulse his older schoolmates possessed. He was bullied with the systematic intensity that only British boarding schools could achieve. Other boys would corner him, beat him, humiliate him in front of his peers. Churchill bore these indignities with a curious combination of defiance and profound loneliness. He understood even then that he was different from other children. Whether this difference was a gift or a curse remained to be determined. His academic performance was unremarkable. In fact, it was worse than unremarkable. It was actively poor. He struggled with mathematics and languages. He sat in classrooms and felt his mind wandering to the stories he invented in private, the battles he orchestrated in imagination, the great deeds he would perform in a future that seemed infinitely distant. His reports from school were a litany of complaints. The boy was lazy, his teachers said. He lacked discipline. He showed no aptitude for serious study. What his teachers failed to understand was that Churchill's mind was occupied with something far more important than the curriculum they were trying to force into him. He was constructing the narrative of his own greatness, rehearsing the speeches he would one day deliver, imagining the applause of audiences that did not yet exist. His adolescence brought a peculiar friendship that would significantly influence his development. A boy named Murrow Wilson took him under his wing, and Wilson convinced young Churchill that the reason he was so small and weak was that he ate no meat. The theory was absurd, the logic nonsensical, but it appealed to Churchill's sense of adventure. For months, he secretly ate meat in defiance of his family's preferences, hiding roasted chicken and mutton in his dormitory room, consuming them after lights out with the conviction that he was ingesting strength itself. Of course, the experiment changed nothing about his physical stature, but it revealed something essential about his character: a willingness to defy conventional wisdom, a hunger for transformation, a belief that through sheer will he could remake himself into whatever was required. At 13 years old, he was married off. Child marriage was common among the aristocracy, a matter of property and lineage rather than sentiment. His bride was a girl named Clementine Hosier, a connection made by parents who saw in the union an alignment of suitable families. The marriage would not be consummated for years, and yet it represented something profound, a commitment to partnership that would define Churchill's life. Clementine would become the one stable point in his universe, the person who loved him not for his achievements or his position, but simply because she had decided to love him. At Sandhurst, the military academy where young men of his class were trained for leadership, something remarkable occurred. For the first time, Churchill found a context where his restless energy could be channeled into something productive. The military academy did not ask him to be a scholar or an athlete. It asked him to be a soldier, to show courage and determination. Here, Churchill could shine. He applied himself with an intensity that surprised everyone who knew him. He understood that the military represented a path to distinction, a way to carve out a place for himself in the world, without relying entirely on his family's connections. When he graduated from Sandhurst in 1894, Churchill was ready to leave England, ready to seek his fortune on distant battlefields, ready to prove that the boy born in the shadow of Blenheim Palace could become something more than a footnote in someone else's story. He had endured 20 years of feeling like an outsider in his own world. He had learned to live with disappointment and rejection. He had developed an unshakable conviction that destiny had chosen him for something significant, even if he had no clear idea what that something might be. The next chapter of his life would be written not in the drawing rooms of England, but in the jungles of foreign lands, where a young man could reinvent himself with every ship that carried him to a new horizon. The ship carrying young Winston Churchill cut through the waters toward Cuba in 1895, and on that voyage something shifted in his understanding of who he was and who he might become. He was not traveling merely as a military officer on routine duty. He was traveling as a correspondent, a writer, someone whose words would be published in newspapers back in England. This dual role, soldier and chronicler, appealed to something fundamental in Churchill's nature. He understood instinctively that how a story is told matters as much as what happens in that story. Cuba in the 1890s was a land of Spanish colonial brutality and insurrectionary passion. The island's indigenous population and the people who had been enslaved there were rising up against Spanish rule, and Spain was responding with the kind of violence that empires always resort to when they believe their control is slipping away. Churchill arrived in this landscape not as a detached observer, but as a participant. He rode with Spanish troops pursuing rebel bands through the jungle. He witnessed combat firsthand, and most importantly, he began to understand something that would shape his entire worldview. That power and civilization were not as stable as they appeared in the drawing rooms of London. Empires could be challenged. Old orders could be disrupted. His dispatches back to England began appearing in the Daily Graphic, and they were unlike anything the newspaper's readers had encountered before. They combined the technical detail of military reporting with the vivid narrative of a talented writer. Churchill had a gift for capturing not just what happened, but what it felt like to be present when it happened. He described the heat of the jungle, the fear of combat, the way men behaved under pressure. His writing made readers feel present at the events he was describing. It was a discovery that would serve him well for the rest of his life. In India, where he traveled next with his regiment, Churchill found himself in an environment of relative peace, and he used that peace to construct something essential. He became a serious reader. His earlier education had been haphazard, interrupted by his own restlessness and his teacher's inability to engage him. But now, in the barracks of India, with time stretching out before him, Churchill began filling the gaps in his knowledge with almost obsessive intensity. He read history and philosophy. He read the great speeches of ancient Rome and Greece. He read everything he could find about the nature of power and leadership. He was teaching himself what his formal education had failed to provide, a comprehensive understanding of the civilization he inhabited. It was in India that he also began to write, and this time not for newspapers but for himself. He started composing fragments of essays and observations, working on his craft the way a musician practices scales. He was beginning to understand that words were his true instrument, far more powerful than any weapon he might wield as a soldier. A gun could kill a man, but words could kill ideas or resurrect them. Words could move nations to action or paralyze them with fear. Words could ensure that a man lived on long after his body had returned to dust. In 1898, Churchill maneuvered himself into position to cover the British campaign in Sudan. This was not difficult for a man with his connections and his determination. He traveled to Sudan as a correspondent, but he also arranged to serve as a junior officer with the 21st Lancers. The combination gave him what he was always seeking: the opportunity to be in the center of important events, to witness history as it unfolded, to have a story worth telling. At Omdurman, the Lancers engaged in the last great cavalry charge of the British Empire. Churchill participated in this charge, riding alongside men who were literally galloping into cannon fire, and he survived. The experience seemed to confirm something he had always believed about himself: that fate had chosen him for something significant, that he possessed a kind of charmed existence that protected him from the ordinary dangers that befell lesser men. But it was South Africa that would truly define this period of his life. The Boer War, which began in 1899, seemed to Churchill like the perfect opportunity to distinguish himself. Here was a major conflict, a test of courage and military skill, a chance to prove his worth in combat. He traveled to South Africa as a correspondent, and in October of 1899, he found himself traveling by train from Durban to Pietermaritzburg. The train was ambushed by Boer forces. Churchill was captured, locked in a prison camp with dozens of other British soldiers, and forced to contemplate a future that suddenly looked very different from the one that he had been imagining. In the darkness of that prison, Churchill experienced something that none of his earlier triumphs had prepared him for: helplessness. He was not in control of his circumstances, his charm, his connections, his determination. None of it mattered here. He was simply a prisoner, stripped of agency, dependent on the whims of his captors. The experience should have broken him. For some men, it would have. But Churchill possessed a peculiar resilience, a refusal to accept defeat even when defeat seemed inevitable. He began planning an escape with the intensity of a man who understands that this moment will define who he becomes. After weeks of captivity, he escaped. The escape itself was a feat of courage and desperation. He crawled through the darkness, moving across territory he didn't know, pursued by men who had every reason to recapture him. He traveled at night, hiding during the day, sustaining himself on minimal food. When he finally reached a British garrison, he had not merely escaped. He had transformed himself into a legend. The newspapers back in England seized on the story with delight. Here was a young British officer, heir to a great military lineage, who had been captured, imprisoned, and had escaped through his own bravery and determination. The story was perfect. It seemed almost too perfect to be true, and yet it was. Churchill returned to England not as a competent officer or an accomplished soldier. He returned as a war hero whose exploits had already been magnified by his own pen, transformed through the alchemy of language into something larger than life. He was not yet 30 years old, and he had already lived multiple lives. He had been a soldier, a journalist, a correspondent, a prisoner, and an escapee. Most importantly, he had learned something essential. The boy from Blenheim Palace who had been so desperate for attention had discovered how to command the world's attention through the power of his own words and the drama of his own deeds. When Winston Churchill entered Parliament in 1900, representing the constituency of Oldham, he was 25 years old and possessed of an ambition so fierce it seemed almost palpable. He had already tasted fame as a soldier and a correspondent. Now he was determined to taste power. The Conservative Party had nominated him, and the voters of Oldham had approved the nomination. Churchill found himself in the House of Commons, a young man surrounded by much older men who had spent decades building their careers, and he immediately set about disrupting the comfortable consensus that held the party together. Churchill's early speeches in Parliament were characterized by a youthful arrogance that sometimes bordered on insolence. He criticized his own party's policies with a directness that older members found shocking. He seemed to believe that the weight of his arguments, the brilliance of his rhetoric, should simply overwhelm any resistance based on tradition or seniority. In this, he revealed a truth about his character that would remain consistent throughout his life. He believed that he was right about things. Not sometimes right, not usually right, but fundamentally and essentially right. When he disagreed with the positions of his party, his conclusion was not that he should accept the party's wisdom. It was that the party was wrong. In 1904, Churchill made a decision that would define his political career and simultaneously mark him as a man of questionable loyalty in the eyes of many of his peers. He crossed the floor of Parliament. He abandoned the Conservative Party to join the Liberal Party. The move was presented as a matter of principle. He disagreed with the Conservatives on the issue of free trade, but everyone understood that it was also a matter of ambition. The Liberals were the party in power, and Churchill belonged wherever power resided. The crossing of the floor was not unusual in British politics of that era, but it was controversial nonetheless. His former colleagues in the Conservative Party saw it as a betrayal, a confirmation of what they had always suspected, that Churchill was fundamentally selfish, willing to abandon principle and loyalty for personal advancement. The accusation stung Churchill precisely because he could not entirely refute it. He believed he was acting on principle, but he also understood that joining the party in power advanced his personal interests. The two motivations were not incompatible, he believed. In fact, they were perfectly aligned. The Liberals welcomed him eagerly. Here was a young man with the youth, charm, military experience, and the kind of oratorical gifts that the party prized. Under the Liberal governments of Asquith and Lloyd George, Churchill's rise was almost absurdly rapid. In 1905, he became president of the Board of Trade. In 1908, he became Home Secretary. In 1911, at the age of 36, he became First Lord of the Admiralty, the position that would define the first part of his career and nearly destroy his reputation. As First Lord of the Admiralty, Churchill found himself in command of the most powerful military institution in the world. The Royal Navy represented the physical embodiment of British power and global dominance. Churchill threw himself into the position with characteristic intensity. He modernized the fleet, introduced new technologies, pushed for innovations in ship design and naval strategy. He visited naval bases. He consulted with officers and engineers. He seemed to believe that the entire future of British power depended on his personal engagement with every detail of naval operations. But Churchill was also thinking beyond the immediate concerns of naval administration. He was watching Europe, watching the rising power of Germany, watching the increasingly tense diplomatic situation that pitted Britain and France against Germany and Austria-Hungary. He sensed, with the kind of intuitive clarity that sometimes comes to those who live intensely, that war was coming. The nations of Europe were locked in an escalating spiral of competition and suspicion, and one spark would ignite a conflagration. In August of 1914, that spark fell, and everything changed. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo set off a chain reaction of alliance obligations and mutual suspicions. Within weeks, Europe was at war. Britain entered the conflict in defense of Belgium, and suddenly Churchill's position as First Lord of the Admiralty became one of the most important in the entire government. He was, at least in his own mind, the man who would direct the naval aspects of the war. He was the strategist who would plan the campaigns that would defeat Germany. Yet the reality of war proved far more complicated and far more brutal than Churchill had anticipated. The conflict that everyone believed would be over by Christmas stretched into year after year of grinding, senseless slaughter. The naval war was less glorious and less conclusive than Churchill had imagined. And then came an opportunity that seemed designed specifically for Churchill's temperament and capabilities. A chance to strike at Germany not through the grinding attrition of the Western Front, but through a bold strategic maneuver in the Dardanelles. The Dardanelles campaign represented Churchill's attempt to apply his strategic vision to the conduct of the war. The idea was audacious. Naval forces would force their way through the Dardanelles Strait and, if successful, could knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war, open a supply line to Russia, and potentially change the entire trajectory of the conflict. Churchill became the campaign's chief advocate, arguing passionately that this was the moment to strike at the Ottomans' weakness, that the naval forces possessed could achieve what ground troops could not. What followed was a disaster. The ships came under devastating fire. The landings, when they came, proved far more difficult than anticipated. Thousands of soldiers from Australia and New Zealand died on beaches that offered no cover, no strategic advantage, no hope of breakthrough. The campaign that was supposed to be a bold stroke of strategic genius became a byword for military incompetence and waste. Churchill's role in orchestrating the campaign meant that he shared in the blame for its failure. The political consequences were swift and devastating. Churchill was removed from the Admiralty in 1915 and given a lesser position. To his humiliation, he was sidelined, pushed to the margins of power, treated by many of his colleagues as a man whose judgment could not be trusted. The brilliant rise that had taken him from Member of Parliament to First Lord of the Admiralty in less than a decade came to an abrupt halt. At age 40, Churchill found himself cast aside, his career seemingly in ruins, his reputation damaged in a way that many believed could never be repaired. He was, for the moment, alone. The 1920s and 1930s unfolded like a slow fade from glory into irrelevance. Churchill held various positions in various governments. He served as Secretary of State for War, then Colonial Secretary. These were respectable positions, but they were not positions of real power. They were the posts given to men who had lost the confidence of their peers, who were being kept on the periphery of genuine authority. Churchill, who had basked in the certainty of his own destiny, found himself relegated to the sidelines, watching younger men make decisions that shaped the future. To survive financially, Churchill began writing prodigiously, books about his life, his war experiences, his political observations, articles for magazines and newspapers. The writing was not merely a financial necessity, though it was that. It was also a way of processing his fall from grace, of maintaining a sense of purpose and meaning when his political career seemed to be stalled. Through writing, Churchill could remain engaged with the great events of his time, even if he was not directly shaping them. He also began to paint, taking up the hobby with the intensity he brought to everything. Painting gave him a way to process emotions that he found difficult to express in words, even for a man as eloquent as Churchill. He painted landscapes, portraits, scenes of military history. He approached painting the way he approached politics and war, as something to be studied intensively, mastered through sheer force of will. During these wilderness years, Churchill's personal life underwent significant changes. His marriage to Clementine remained stable, and they had several children together. But the marriage was not passionate. Churchill and Clementine had settled into a kind of companionable partnership, based on deep affection rather than romantic intensity. Clementine understood her husband's nature, his ambitions, his restlessness, his fundamental need to be at the center of important events. She accepted these traits in him and, in her quiet way, supported his attempts to remain relevant. In the early 1930s, as Adolf Hitler began his rise to power in Germany, Churchill began to shift his focus. He was no longer primarily concerned with his own political rehabilitation. He was increasingly focused on what he saw as a growing threat to European peace and stability. Hitler represented something that Churchill understood intuitively. A man who believed that history could be bent to his will through the application of sufficient will and violence. Churchill began to warn Parliament. In speech after speech, he argued that Britain was making a catastrophic mistake in trying to appease Hitler. The government under Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain was convinced that Hitler could be managed, that his grievances could be satisfied through negotiation and compromise, that another great war could be avoided. Churchill thought this was madness. He believed that Hitler was fundamentally opposed to the British way of life, that his ambitions could not be satisfied through negotiation, that he would continue to expand his power until he was stopped by force. The problem was that almost no one agreed with Churchill. The British people were exhausted by the memory of the First World War. The economic depression of the 1930s had left the nation weary and demoralized. No one wanted to hear warnings about another war. No one wanted to believe that Hitler represented an existential threat to British civilization. Churchill's speeches were dismissed as those of a warmonger, a man who had never accepted that the First World War had been the war to end all wars. But Churchill could not silence himself. The conviction that he was right, which had defined his entire life, now manifested as a compulsion to speak out against the growing darkness in Europe. He gave speech after speech. He wrote article after article. He gave warnings that fell on increasingly impatient ears. Friends told him that he was destroying what remained of his political reputation. Political allies distanced themselves from him. The press began to mock him openly, suggesting that he was unbalanced, obsessed, unable to move beyond his past glories. What Churchill did not realize, what no one could have fully realized, was that these wilderness years were not a punishment or a defeat. They were a preparation. The very isolation that drove him to despair was also stripping away anything false or superficial in his character. The man who emerged from these years was not the ambitious climber of his youth. He was something far more formidable, a man who had been tested by irrelevance and loneliness, who had maintained his conviction and his purpose even when the entire world seemed to be against him, who had learned to live with uncertainty while maintaining absolute certainty about what he believed to be true. Chapter 5. The Call to Power, May 1940. The morning of May 10, 1940 arrived like a thunderclap that had been building for years. Germany had invaded France. The British Expeditionary Force, sent to defend France alongside the French army, suddenly found itself in danger of being surrounded and destroyed. The government of Neville Chamberlain, which had spent years trying to appease Hitler, which had clung to the belief that war could be avoided through negotiation and compromise, suddenly found itself in a state of panic. Everyone understood, in that terrible morning, that they had been catastrophically wrong. Hitler was not going to be managed. He was not going to be satisfied with limited territorial gains. He intended to conquer Europe, and Britain stood next in his path. That afternoon, Neville Chamberlain resigned as Prime Minister. The question that gripped Parliament, that gripped the entire nation, was who would replace him. There were various possibilities. Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, was a possibility. But Halifax did not possess the kind of will that the moment demanded. David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister who had led Britain through the First World War, was considered and rejected as too old, too associated with the previous conflict. Then Parliament turned to Winston Churchill, the man who had been dismissed as a warmonger, the man whose warnings had been ignored for years, the man whom many in the British establishment still blamed for the Dardanelles Disaster of 1915, was suddenly deemed to be the only man who could lead the nation through the crisis ahead. Churchill was 65 years old, at an age when most men were preparing for retirement. When he had spent nearly a quarter-century in relative obscurity and disgrace, he was being asked to become Prime Minister of a nation fighting for its survival. Churchill arrived at 10 Downing Street that evening and moved through the residence with a curious sense of recognition. He had been here before, occupying lesser positions, but now he was at the top, and he seemed to know intuitively what needed to be done. He understood that the nation needed leadership, not false hope. He understood that the British people, confronting the possibility of invasion and defeat, needed someone who would tell them the truth about their circumstances, while simultaneously giving them reasons to believe that persistence might transform impossibility into survival. That night, he began to compose the first speech he would deliver as Prime Minister, the speech that would define his entire leadership and establish the tone for the war that lay ahead. He worked late into the evening, surrounded by his advisors and assistants, crafting language that would somehow capture both the absolute gravity of the moment and a kind of stubborn, irrational hope that the British could endure. 3 days later, on May 13th, Churchill stood in the House of Commons and delivered the speech that would echo across generations. "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat," he began. He did not promise quick victory. He did not pretend that the road ahead would be easy. Instead, he simply told the truth about what was coming whilst simultaneously asserting that Britain would endure. The speech was not designed to comfort. It was designed to steel the nation's resolve, to remind the British people of what they were fighting for, to suggest that there was something inside the British character that could not be defeated, regardless of the circumstances. As Churchill spoke, something shifted in the House of Commons, in the streets of Britain, in the minds of people who had been terrified by the apparent inevitability of German victory. Here was someone who was not going to lie to them. Here was someone who understood the true magnitude of the danger they faced, and who was choosing to fight anyway. Here was someone who seemed to believe, with an almost irrational intensity, that British civilization could be preserved even in the face of apparently overwhelming odds. The boy from Blenheim Palace, who had been so desperately seeking recognition all his life, had finally found the role he was meant to play. In the moment when his nation needed a voice that could make sense of chaos, that could articulate a vision worth fighting for, that could convince ordinary people to endure extraordinary suffering, Churchill stepped forward. He was not perfect. He would make mistakes. He would face moments of profound doubt and uncertainty. But in that moment, he became what history required him to be, a leader equal to the magnitude of the crisis his nation faced. The summer of 1940 descended upon London like a nightmare made flesh. Every night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the air raid sirens would begin their wailing cry, and the city would transform. Families would gather their most precious possessions, their children, their pets, and make their way to the underground stations that had been hastily converted into air raid shelters. The German Luftwaffe had begun a bombing campaign of almost unimaginable scale and intensity. Night after night, bombers descended from the darkness above, releasing their loads on a city that seemed defenseless against the assault from the sky. Churchill moved through the bombed-out neighborhoods with a deliberateness that seemed almost ceremonial. After each night of bombing, after the fires had been extinguished and the bodies had been carried away, the Prime Minister would appear in the rubble. He would walk among the destroyed homes. He would speak to the people who had lost everything. He would stand in the ruins, wearing his characteristic dark suit, his face grave but not hopeless. And he would somehow communicate through his very presence that this suffering meant something, that it was not meaningless destruction, but rather a test that the British people could endure. His famous walk through the East End of London, where whole neighborhoods had been destroyed, became a kind of secular miracle. The people of the East End, who had every reason to be angry, who had lost their homes and their possessions, who were living in the midst of devastation, seemed to find something in Churchill's presence that sustained them. They cheered him. They reached out to touch him. They seemed to understand that their leader was not sheltering in some comfortable location while they endured the bombing. He was present. He was witnessing. He was bearing witness to their suffering. The Blitz, as the bombing campaign came to be called, was designed by the German High Command to break the morale of the British people, to make them demand that their government surrender to Hitler's demands. The strategy was based on a rational assumption. If you make the cost of resistance high enough, eventually people will choose surrender over continued suffering. It was a strategy that had worked in other places, in other times. But it did not work in Britain during the summer of 1940. Something in the British character, something that Churchill seemed to understand intuitively, rebelled against the logic of surrender. In the shelters, as families huddled together during the long nights while bombs fell above, a strange sense of community emerged. Strangers became companions. Social boundaries that normally separated classes seemed to dissolve in the shared experience of danger. People sang together. They told jokes. They endured. And Churchill, understanding the power of symbols and rhetoric, made a point of appearing in those shelters, of moving among the people who were sheltering there, of reminding them through his presence that they were not merely victims, but participants in a great historical struggle. He delivered his speeches with a mastery of timing and phrasing that seemed almost supernatural. The speech about the Royal Air Force pilots, never in the field of human conflict, was so much owed by so many to so few, captured something essential about the moment. Young men, many of them not yet 25 years old, were flying their fighter aircraft up to meet the German bombers, often flying multiple sorties in a single day, knowing that a significant percentage of them would not survive the war. They were flying to defend not a territory or a resource, but a way of life, a civilization, an idea about what human society could be. Churchill understood that these young pilots were modern knights, engaged in combat that was almost medieval in its personal nature. Two men in flying machines meeting in the sky above their homeland, one trying to kill the other, both aware that they might die in the next moment. Churchill's gift was to see the nobility in this sacrifice, to lift it from the realm of military necessity into something approaching the sacred. His speeches during this period were masterpieces of morale building, not because they offered false hope, but because they told the truth about the magnitude of the challenge, while simultaneously suggesting that this challenge was worth enduring. Behind the scenes, Churchill was thinking constantly about how to transform Britain's desperate situation into something that might lead to eventual victory. In 1941, he made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable just a few years earlier. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union, Churchill immediately moved to establish an alliance with Stalin's communist state. The irony was exquisite. Churchill had spent much of his career warning about the dangers of communism. He had fought against the Bolsheviks in the Russian Civil War. He had been deeply suspicious of Soviet intentions and Soviet ideology. Now, facing an even greater threat, he was willing to set all of that aside. If Hitler invaded hell, Churchill reportedly said, I would make at least a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. The comment captured his pragmatic assessment of the moment. Ideology and historical enmity had to be set aside when facing an existential threat. The enemy of your enemy, even if that enemy was communism, had to become your ally if the alternative was destruction. This willingness to subordinate ideological concerns to strategic necessity would become one of the defining features of Churchill's leadership during the war. He was not fighting for capitalism or democracy or any particular vision of society. He was fighting to prevent Hitler from conquering the world. Everything else was secondary to that central objective. This pragmatism sometimes troubled him. He was a man of conviction, a man who believed in things, and yet circumstances forced him to compromise with people he despised and ideas he opposed. By the end of 1941, the Blitz had ended. The German bombers were no longer coming night after night to devastate London, but the war was far from over. In fact, it was becoming clear that this would be a long struggle, possibly lasting years. Churchill had to contemplate a future in which Britain would be fighting not just for survival, but for eventual victory, and he had to do this knowing that his nation's resources were limited, that his nation was dependent on the United States for material support, that the outcome of the war was far from certain. The speeches he gave during this period were perhaps his greatest achievement as an orator. They combined the soaring language of a poet with the precise detail of a military commander. They moved from moments of near despair to moments of stubborn determination. They reminded the British people that they were not merely defending their own island, but defending civilization itself. They suggested somehow that out of the blood and suffering and tears of this war, a new world might emerge. Not necessarily a better world, but a world in which human values and human dignity had been preserved. The war room deep beneath London was a strange cathedral to the enterprise of total war. Maps covered the walls, showing the disposition of forces across 3 continents. Telephones connected the room to commanders in distant locations. Here, Churchill spent much of his time watching the progress of the war, making decisions that would affect the lives of millions of people. He had aged noticeably since becoming prime minister. The weight of leadership was visible in his face, in the way his shoulders bent slightly under the burden of what he carried. Churchill understood something about the nature of modern warfare that many of his military advisors seemed not to grasp. This war would be decided not just by military victories, but by the ability to sustain the war effort, by the willingness of populations to endure suffering, and by the relationships between the leaders of the great powers. He spent an enormous amount of time thinking about how to maintain the alliance with the Soviet Union, how to keep the United States engaged in the war, how to manage the complex web of relationships and rivalries that characterized the alliance against Hitler. In August of 1941, Churchill traveled to Newfoundland to meet with President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The meeting took place aboard a warship in the Atlantic Ocean, and it produced what became known as the Atlantic Charter, a statement of the principles for which the Allies were fighting. The charter spoke of the right of peoples to choose their own form of government, of the importance of individual liberty, of the desirability of a world after the war in which nations would cooperate for the common good. It was a document that sounded like the aspirations of democracy itself, and yet Churchill signed it with a curious ambivalence. He was committing Britain to principles that would, in the post-war world, make the continuation of the British Empire extremely difficult. The relationship between Churchill and Roosevelt was one of the most important relationships of the war. The two men represented very different nations and very different political traditions. Roosevelt was a Democrat committed to the principles of democratic governance. Churchill was a conservative, rooted in the traditions of the British Empire, skeptical of democratic sentiment when it conflicted with what he saw as necessary national interests. Yet they found a basis for deep cooperation and, in their own way, for genuine affection. Churchill would later say that the war years were the happiest of his life. This statement puzzled many people. How could the years of terrible conflict, years in which millions died, years in which his nation was under constant threat, be the happiest years of his life? The answer lay in the fact that during these years, Churchill finally felt that he had found a role worthy of his ambitions, a stage grand enough for the performance of his personality. He was no longer seeking vindication or recognition. He was simply doing what he believed he was meant to do, leading his nation through its darkest hour. In November of 1941, Churchill traveled to Moscow to meet with Stalin. The journey itself was a demonstration of commitment. At age 66, traveling in the midst of a war, facing constant danger, Churchill made the journey to the Soviet capital to meet with the man who had ruled the Soviet Union with an iron fist for nearly 2 decades. Stalin was not an easy man to like. He was cold, calculating, suspicious of everyone around him. Yet Churchill recognized in Stalin a kind of kindred spirit, a man who understood power, who was willing to do what was necessary to achieve his objectives, who could not be swayed by sentiment or ideological argument, but only by calculations of interest and strength. The meetings between Churchill and Stalin were tense and often difficult. They disagreed about strategy. They disagreed about what the post-war world should look like. Stalin was intensely suspicious of British intentions, convinced that Britain was trying to manipulate him into bearing the brunt of the fighting against Germany, while Britain and America preserved their strength for the post-war period. Churchill was intensely suspicious of Soviet intentions, convinced that Stalin was already thinking about how to expand Soviet influence in Europe and Asia once the war was over. Yet despite these suspicions, they managed to work together. Churchill flew to other meetings in Casablanca and Cairo and Tehran. At each of these meetings, the Allies discussed strategy, coordinated their military operations, and began to sketch out what the post-war world might look like. Churchill advocated forcefully for British interests. He wanted to ensure that Britain would maintain its position as a great power in the post-war world. He was deeply concerned about the preservation of the British Empire, which he saw as a civilizing force in the world. He was skeptical of the kind of post-war world that the Americans seemed to be envisioning, a world of democratic self-determination that would inevitably undermine the imperial structures that had defined much of the 19th and early 20th centuries. But Churchill also understood that Britain's ability to influence the post-war world was limited by Britain's relative weakness. The United States had emerged from the war as the world's most powerful nation. The Soviet Union had suffered terribly, but had also demonstrated an enormous capacity for mobilizing its resources and sustaining the fight against Germany. Britain, despite Churchill's leadership and despite the courage of the British people, was becoming a junior partner in the alliance that was defeating Hitler. This realization, while Churchill did not fully articulate it to himself or to others, was beginning to shape his thinking about what Britain's future should be. By 1943, it was becoming increasingly clear that Germany could not win the war. The Soviet Union, despite suffering terrible losses, was gradually pushing the German armies back. The Americans and British were preparing for a major invasion of occupied Europe. German cities were being pounded by British and American bombers. German resources were being stretched to the breaking point. Yet none of this made the war any less brutal or less devastating. In fact, as Germany's position became more desperate, the fighting became more fierce, more intense, more devastating in its human cost. Churchill threw himself into the planning for the invasion of Normandy with characteristic energy and focus. He consulted with military strategists. He visited troops in preparation for the invasion. He thought constantly about how to ensure that the invasion would succeed, that the beachhead in Normandy could be established and held and eventually expanded. He was obsessed with the details of the operation, and he sometimes drove his military commanders to distraction with his constant questions and suggestions. On June 6, 1944, the invasion began. Churchill watched the reports come in throughout the day. The beaches of Normandy were being secured by American and British and Canadian forces. The invasion, which could have been a catastrophic failure, appeared to be succeeding. Churchill felt a tremendous sense of relief and vindication. All of the planning, all of the coordination with the Americans, all of the complex negotiations with the Soviets seemed to be bearing fruit. Europe was being liberated from Nazi occupation, and Britain was playing a central role in that liberation. Yet, as victory came into sight, Churchill was already grappling with questions about the post-war world. He understood that the Soviet Union would emerge from the war with an enormous amount of influence over Eastern Europe. He understood that the United States would likely withdraw from European affairs once the war was over, leaving a power vacuum that someone would inevitably fill. He understood that the world order that emerged from this war would look very different from the world order that had existed before. In the final months of the war, Churchill began to make statements that revealed his thinking about the post-war world. He spoke about the need for Britain to maintain its position as a great power. He spoke about the importance of the British Empire as a stabilizing force in the world. He seemed to be preparing for a post-war struggle with the Soviet Union, even as the war against Germany was still being fought. This was Churchill at his most strategic, thinking several moves ahead, trying to position Britain for success in the world that would emerge once the war was over. In February of 1945, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin met at Yalta, a resort town in Crimea. It was one of the most famous conferences of the war, and it represented the moment at which the shape of the post-war world was essentially decided. The decisions made at Yalta would echo through the next 50 years of history. Eastern Europe would fall under Soviet influence. Germany would be divided into occupation zones controlled by the Americans, British, Soviets, and French. The Soviet Union would enter the war against Japan and would receive territorial compensation for doing so. The United Nations would be established as an organization designed to prevent future wars and to maintain international peace and security. Churchill watched these agreements being hammered out, and he watched with a sense of profound ambivalence. He understood that they were necessary, that the Allies had to coordinate their policies in order to defeat Germany and Japan. Yet he also understood that some of these agreements would have consequences that would not become apparent until long after the war was over. He signed the agreements, but he did so with the knowledge that he was consenting to a division of Europe that would last far longer than any of them anticipated. When Germany surrendered in May of 1945, Churchill was vindicated in a way that few leaders have ever been vindicated. He had warned about Hitler when almost everyone else was trying to appease him. He had led his nation through the war when it seemed likely that Britain would be conquered. He had maintained the alliance with the Soviet Union and the United States despite the deep ideological differences that separated these nations. He had turned what might have been a catastrophic defeat into a victory. Britain had survived. Western civilization, or so it seemed, had been preserved. Yet the victory, when it came, was incomplete in ways that Churchill found troubling. The Soviet Union had emerged from the war as a superpower. The United States had emerged as the dominant global power. Britain, despite its victories, was depleted and exhausted. The empire that Churchill loved, the empire that had defined his entire career, was beginning to fragment. Indian independence was coming. The colonial possessions that had once seemed so securely British were beginning to demand their freedom. The world that Churchill had fought to preserve was already transforming into something he had not fully intended. The timing seemed almost cruel. The war in Europe was over. Churchill had led Britain to victory against Nazi Germany. The British people were grateful and proud. Surely, Churchill believed, they would reward him with a renewed mandate to govern, to lead the nation into the peace as he had led it through the war. In July of 1945, he called a general election. Churchill campaigned with the same energy and commitment he brought to everything else. He delivered speeches of extraordinary power and eloquence. He reminded the British people of the struggle they had endured, of the role Britain had played in preserving civilization, of the importance of maintaining strong British leadership in the post-war world. His speeches were masterpieces of rhetoric and persuasion. But they were also, in a crucial way, backward-looking. Churchill was asking the British people to reward his past performance, to vote for him based on what he had accomplished during the war. The British people, however, were looking forward. They were exhausted by war. They were living in a nation where homes had been destroyed, where rationing was severe, where the economy was shattered. They wanted not more of what they had experienced, but something different, something new. They wanted a government that would provide them with housing, with health care, with social security, with the basic necessities of a decent life. The Labour Party, led by Clement Attlee, promised these things. They promised to build a new Britain, a Britain that would be more equal, more just, more prosperous. Churchill's campaign made a strategic error that would haunt him for the rest of his life. In one broadcast, he suggested that a Labour government would require some form of Gestapo to enforce its policies. The comment was intended as a rhetorical flourish, a way of suggesting that the Labour Party's policies were authoritarian and dangerous. But it revealed something fundamental about Churchill's worldview. He associated strong government intervention in the economy with totalitarianism. He seemed unable to imagine that a government could provide for its people's basic needs without thereby becoming oppressive. The British people rejected this argument. On July 26, 1945, the election results came in. Labour had won in a landslide. Churchill, the war hero, the man who had saved his nation, was defeated. Clement Attlee, a modest, quiet man, who lacked Churchill's charisma and eloquence, would become the next prime minister. The British people had spoken, and they had said, essentially, that they were grateful for Churchill's leadership during the war, but that they wanted someone else to lead them into the future. Churchill accepted the verdict with surprising grace. He moved into opposition, where he would spend the next 6 years. But the defeat hurt him deeply. He had believed with the certainty that it characterized so much of his life, that he was the man the nation needed. He had believed that his leadership during the war proved his fitness to govern during the peace. The British people had disagreed, and Churchill had to come to terms with the fact that even the greatest achievements cannot guarantee future success. In opposition, Churchill evolved. He was no longer focused on winning elections or maintaining power. Instead, he became something new, the elder statesman, the voice of warning about the future, the man who could observe the great events of the post-war world with a kind of detachment that had not been possible when he was in power. He continued to speak and write, but his focus shifted. He was less interested in immediate political struggles and more interested in the great strategic questions that would define the post-war world. It was during this period that Churchill began to develop his thinking about European unity. He recognized that Europe, devastated by the war, would need to rebuild, and that this rebuilding would require a kind of cooperation that went beyond the traditional nation-state system. He spoke about the possibility of a United States of Europe, a union that would prevent future wars and create a stable foundation for European prosperity. The irony, which Churchill recognized, was that Britain itself might not be part of this European Union. Britain was, in his mind, separate from Europe, tied more to the United States and to the Commonwealth than to the European continent. On March 5, 1946, Churchill delivered one of the most consequential speeches of his entire life. Speaking at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, he uttered a phrase that would define the next 45 years of international relations. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent, he declared. In a single sentence, Churchill had named the emerging reality of the post-war world. The Soviet Union, which had been an ally during the war, was now revealing itself to be an adversary, a competitor for influence and power in the post-war order. The Iron Curtain speech was not a call to war. It was a call to vigilance, to the maintenance of strength, to a patient and determined opposition to Soviet expansion. Churchill understood that the Soviet Union operated from a different set of assumptions than the Western democracies. Stalin was thinking about security in terms of spheres of influence, buffer zones, the kind of geopolitical calculations that had defined European politics for centuries. He was not interested in spreading democracy or individual liberty. He was interested in ensuring that the Soviet Union would never again be vulnerable to invasion from the West, and he was willing to use whatever means were necessary to achieve this objective. Churchill's speech was controversial. Many people, particularly in America, believed that he was being unnecessarily provocative, that he was undermining the possibility of continued cooperation with the Soviet Union. Some on the left suggested that he was trying to start a new war, but Churchill persisted in his warnings. He was convinced that he was right about Soviet intentions, and he was willing to endure criticism and dismissal in order to articulate what he believed to be true. In 1951, Churchill returned to office as Prime Minister for the second time. He was now 76 years old, an age at which most men would be retired or dead. But Churchill had not finished his work. He believed that there was still much to be done, that Britain still had a role to play in the post-war world, that he still had something to contribute to the ongoing struggle against Soviet expansion. His final years as Prime Minister were dominated by this preoccupation with the Soviet threat. He met with American presidents. He advocated for the maintenance of Western strength. He called for continued vigilance against Soviet ambitions. But he also began to think about the possibility of negotiations with the Soviet Union, about the possibility that dialogue might reduce tensions and make mutual understanding possible. By the end of his life, Churchill had evolved from the fierce wartime leader into something more nuanced, a statesman who understood that eternal enmity with the Soviet Union was not sustainable, but that eternal vigilance was necessary. The news arrived like a death in the family. India was demanding independence, and the British government, under Clement Attlee, was granting it. Churchill received the news with a sense of profound dismay. He had not dedicated his life to preserving the British Empire only to watch it dissolve into the years following victory. Yet dissolve it would, and Churchill could do very little to prevent it. The tide of history was flowing in a direction that he could not ultimately resist, no matter how fierce his opposition. India had been the crown jewel of the British Empire. For nearly 2 centuries, Britain had ruled over the Indian subcontinent, and that rule had defined Britain's status as a global power. The wealth extracted from India, the resources, the military manpower, the prestige of ruling over hundreds of millions of people, all of this had been central to British greatness. Now, in 1947, India was declaring itself independent, and the empire that had seemed so permanent was beginning to crumble. Churchill had opposed Indian independence throughout his career. He had made speeches against it, written articles denouncing the independence movement, expressed his conviction that British rule was a civilizing force that benefited the Indian people. He had been particularly contemptuous of Mahatma Gandhi, viewing him as a seditious agitator whose methods of non-violent resistance were fundamentally un-English. When Gandhi was assassinated in 1948, Churchill's response revealed the depth of his prejudice. He expressed no sympathy for the man who had liberated hundreds of millions of people from colonial rule through nonviolence. Instead, he seemed to view the assassination as confirmation that the independence movement was fundamentally destabilizing. Yet Churchill's opposition to Indian independence, strongly held as it was, could not alter the historical reality. The Indian people had decided that they wanted to govern themselves. They had elected a government committed to independence. Britain, exhausted and depleted by the war, lacked the resources and the will to maintain control over India by force. Independence came, and with it, the beginning of the end of the British Empire. One by one, the dominions and colonies that had constituted the empire began to demand independence. Ceylon left the empire. Burma left. Kenya was embroiled in a bitter conflict between British settlers and indigenous people demanding freedom. The very network of political relationships that had given Britain its global power and prestige was dissolving. Churchill watched this process with something approaching despair. He had not fought the war to preserve democracy and freedom, only to see those principles applied to peoples demanding liberation from British rule. Yet there was a deeper contradiction at work in Churchill's thinking. He had fought World War II not merely to preserve British power, but to defend freedom and democracy against totalitarianism. The problem was that the colonized peoples of the empire now expected that those same principles of freedom and democracy would apply to them. You cannot fight a war in the name of democratic values and then deny those values to your own subject peoples without revealing a fundamental hypocrisy at the heart of your position. Churchill understood this intellectually, but he resisted it emotionally. The empire had given Britain its greatness, or so he believed. Without the empire, what was Britain? A small island, cold and wet, with a declining economy and a diminished global role. Yet this was precisely what Britain was becoming in the post-war world. Churchill had saved Britain from Nazi conquest, only to watch as the Britain he saved lost its imperial dominion through the very process of democratic decolonization that the victory had made possible. As Churchill's final years as Prime Minister approached, he seemed to accept the inevitable. He could not restore the empire to what it had been. No one could. The world had changed in ways that made the old imperial structures obsolete. Britain would have to find a new role in the post-war world, a role that did not depend on direct political control over vast territories and hundreds of millions of people. This realization, while Churchill eventually came to accept it, never quite stopped paining him. The empire had been the great work of his lifetime, the thing that had given his life meaning and purpose. To watch it dissolve felt like watching the dissolution of his own significance. Churchill resigned as Prime Minister in 1955, at the age of 80. His doctor had advised him that his health was failing, that he should step aside and allow a younger man to lead the nation. Churchill resisted at first, but he eventually accepted the inevitable. He had been Prime Minister during Britain's darkest hour and during the early years of the post-war peace. He had done what he could. Now it was time to step aside. He moved into his final decade with a curious mixture of acceptance and lingering sorrow. He was still recognized as one of the great figures of his age. He was consulted on matters of state importance. He continued to write, to paint, to reflect on the life he had lived and the world he had helped to shape. He became, in a sense, a kind of living monument to the age that was passing away. Churchill had lived through the transformation of Britain from a global imperial power to a secondary power dependent on American support. He had witnessed the rise of the Soviet Union as a superpower. He had seen the beginning of the nuclear age and understood the existential threat that nuclear weapons posed to human civilization. In his final years, Churchill made peace with many of the things that had troubled him during his active political career. He came to see Indian independence not as a defeat, but as an inevitable historical process. He came to understand that the Soviet Union, while dangerous, could not be defeated militarily, but only contained and managed through a combination of strength and diplomacy. He began to speak about the possibility of negotiating with the Soviet Union, of finding common ground on which the two superpowers could build a more stable relationship. There was a note of weariness in these final reflections. Churchill had been proven right about so many things. He had been right about Hitler. He had been right about Stalin. His warnings about Soviet expansion had been vindicated. Yet this vindication brought no satisfaction. Being right, Churchill seemed to understand in his final years, is not the same thing as being happy. He had glimpsed, in his old age, that history is far more complicated than even the wisest warnings can capture, that being correct about the future does not necessarily mean you get to shape it according to your desires. Churchill died on January 24, 1965, at the age of 90. The nation that he had led through the war gave him a state funeral of extraordinary grandeur. Dignitaries from around the world traveled to London to pay their respects. His coffin was carried through the streets of the city that he had saved from Nazi conquest. Politicians who had disagreed with him bitterly during his life came to acknowledge his historical significance. In death, Churchill was honored in a way that he had sometimes been denied in life. His legacy was complex and contested. He had led Britain through its darkest hour and preserved it from conquest. This was undeniable, yet his legacy also included his opposition to Indian independence, his romanticization of empire, his occasional expressions of racial ideas that by modern standards would be considered deeply offensive. Churchill was a man of his time in ways both noble and troubling. He had fought to preserve Western civilization against fascism, but he had also fought to preserve the structures of imperial power that had defined the 19th century and the early 20th century. In the decades after his death, historians and political figures began to grapple with the complexity of Churchill's legacy. Some lionized him as the greatest statesman of the 20th century, the man who had single-handedly saved Western civilization from Nazi conquest. Others criticized him for his imperialism, his racism, his romantic attachment to an empire that had no future. Most serious scholars came to the conclusion that Churchill was both things, a great leader in a moment of supreme crisis, and a man whose worldview was shaped by imperialism and whose understanding of the future was limited by his attachment to the past. Yet what seemed clear, even to those who criticized Churchill most severely, was that he had possessed something rare and valuable: the ability to articulate a vision in moments of profound darkness, the capacity to inspire ordinary people to endure extraordinary suffering, the conviction that human values and human dignity were worth fighting for even when the odds seemed impossibly against success. These qualities, whatever Churchill's limitations, gave his life and his leadership a lasting significance that few political figures have achieved. The sound of air raid sirens is a sound that people who lived through the Blitz could never quite forget. It was a wailing cry that came without warning, signaling that German bombers were approaching, that the sky above would soon rain death and destruction, that everyone needed to get to safety as quickly as possible. The Blitz began in the summer of 1940 and continued for months. It was one of the most sustained and intensive bombing campaigns ever launched against a civilian population. Night after night, German bombers descended on London, on Coventry, on Birmingham, on dozens of other British cities. The bombers would arrive after dark and stay until dawn, dropping their loads of explosives and incendiary devices on the cities below. Entire neighborhoods would be destroyed in a single night. Hundreds of thousands of people lost their homes. Tens of thousands died. The bombing was designed to break British morale, to make the civilian population demand that their government surrender. Yet something unexpected happened. The British people did not break. In fact, the bombing seemed to strengthen their resolve. In the underground stations where people sheltered during the night raids, a strange communal spirit emerged. Strangers became companions. Social boundaries that normally separated classes seemed to dissolve in the shared experience of danger. People sang together in the shelters. They told jokes to keep their spirits up. They endured. Churchill understood that this moment, more than any military victory, would define the war and Britain's role in it. He insisted on visiting the bombed neighborhoods after each night of bombing, walking among the ruins, speaking to people who had lost everything. His presence carried a message. The leader shares the suffering of the people. He did not shelter in some comfortable location while the people endured the bombing. He was present. He was witnessing. He was bearing witness to their suffering. During the Battle of Britain, when RAF pilots fought the Luftwaffe in the skies above the English Channel, Churchill delivered one of his most famous remarks. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few, he said, referring to the young pilots who were fighting to defend the nation. The phrase captured something essential about this moment. A small group of young men, many of them not yet 25 years old, were flying their fighter aircraft up to meet the German bombers. They were often flying multiple sorties in a single day, knowing that many of them would not survive the war. These pilots were not fighting for territorial conquest or material gain. They were fighting for home, for the preservation of a way of life, for the abstract but powerful idea that some things were worth dying for. Churchill's gift was to see the nobility in this sacrifice, to elevate it from mere military necessity into something approaching the sacred. His speeches during this period were not designed to comfort. They were designed to steel the nation's resolve, to remind ordinary people that they were engaged in something larger than themselves. What made Churchill such an effective leader during this period was not any particular military genius. His military decisions were sometimes questionable, sometimes even wrong, but his ability to see the battle that was being fought not just on the military front, but in the hearts and minds of the people. He understood that in total war, the civilian population is as important as the soldiers. He understood that morale is a weapon as powerful as guns. He understood that words, spoken at the right moment with sufficient conviction, could transform fear into determination. The Battle of Britain was won not by any single general or military commander, but by the collective will of the British people and the RAF pilots who defended them. Churchill's role was not to devise brilliant military strategies, but to articulate the spiritual and moral dimension of the struggle, to remind people of what they were fighting for, to suggest somehow that British civilization was worth preserving even at the cost of tremendous suffering. In this role, he was extraordinary. The boy who had always been restless, always seeking grand challenges, had finally found the challenge that his entire life had been unconsciously preparing him for. If Churchill had been nothing but a politician, history would have quickly forgotten him. If he had been merely a general or a strategist, he might have been remembered as competent but not exceptional. What made Churchill eternal? What gave his leadership a power that transcended military victory or political office was his absolute mastery of language. Words were Churchill's true weapon, more powerful than any army, more enduring than any empire. He understood, with an almost supernatural clarity, that the way something is said is often more important than what is said. Churchill had discovered the power of language early in his life. As a young boy in boarding school, he had been small and awkward, bullied by other children. But he had discovered that he could move people with words, that he could command attention through rhetoric, that he could transform the way people thought about things through the careful choice and arrangement of words. This discovery gave him a kind of power that physical strength could never provide. He was not the strongest boy in the school, but he could be the most persuasive. Throughout his political career, Churchill was recognized as an extraordinary speaker. His speeches combined classical references with contemporary politics. They moved between the soaring and the practical. They used humor to disarm audiences and poetry to elevate ordinary political debates into matters of historical consequence. When he warned about Hitler, he did it with the urgency of a modern Cassandra warning Troy of impending doom. When he called upon the British people to endure, he did it with the resonance of someone asking people to imagine themselves as participants in something larger than themselves, something that would be remembered for generations. Churchill had a particular gift for the memorable phrase, the phrase that would echo across generations. Blood, toil, tears and sweat. Never surrender. Their finest hour. The Iron Curtain. These phrases worked because they were not mere rhetoric, not empty words designed to manipulate emotions. They were the distilled essence of complex ideas made simple enough for everyone to understand, yet profound enough that they contained layers of meaning that could be unpacked for decades. He understood that in moments of great historical consequence, people do not remember the detailed arguments and the careful reasoning. They remember the emotional power of the words used to describe those moments. They remember how they felt when they heard those words. They remember the confidence and conviction with which those words were delivered. Churchill spent enormous time crafting his speeches, sometimes working an entire day on a broadcast that would last less than an hour. He would write and rewrite, searching for exactly the right word, the right phrase, the right cadence of speech. Churchill understood that the human voice itself was a kind of instrument that could be played with skill and intention. He practiced his speeches obsessively, not just reading them over and over, but actually delivering them aloud, working on the pacing, the rhythm, the emphasis. He understood that a word spoken with a particular inflection could carry a meaning that the same word spoken differently could not convey. His voice, gravelly, slow, with careful pronunciation of every word, became as recognizable as his physical appearance. In Churchill's speeches during the war years, you can hear a man who has finally found his true purpose. The restlessness that had driven him through decades of political climbing and military service had found an outlet. He was being asked to do the one thing he did better than anyone, to speak words that would change the trajectory of history. He was being asked to make people understand that they possessed the strength to endure what seemed unendurable, that sacrifice could mean something, that their suffering was not meaningless destruction, but rather a test of character that they could pass. What Churchill seemed to understand intuitively was that rhetoric, when deployed with genuine conviction and poetic power, is not manipulation. It is truth-telling. It is the art of making people understand things that they already know but have not yet fully grasped. Churchill was not inventing the courage of the British people. He was revealing it, helping them to understand their own strength, reminding them of their own capacity for endurance. In his final years, Churchill reflected on the role that language and rhetoric had played in his life. He had become famous as a soldier, as a politician, as a military leader. But the thing that had truly mattered, the thing that had given his life its significance, was his ability to speak. He had used words to inspire his nation through its darkest hour. He had used words to warn the world about dangers ahead. He had used words to articulate the values and principles that he believed were worth fighting for. In the end, Churchill's greatest legacy was not any particular military victory or political achievement. It was the demonstration that words, spoken with absolute conviction and poetic power, can move mountains. They can transform despair into hope. They can make ordinary people understand themselves as participants in grand historical events. They can ensure that long after the speaker is gone, his voice continues to echo, reminding future generations of the power of language to shape the world. And so, as the night deepens and Churchill's story draws to its close, we understand something essential about him. He was not a man who merely reacted to history. He was a man who shaped history through the sheer force of his will, his eloquence, and his unwavering conviction that human civilization was worth fighting for. The boy from Blenheim Palace, unwanted and desperate for attention, had transformed himself into a voice that spoke for an entire nation, and in some ways, for all of humanity. His words remain with us still, reminding us that in the darkest moments, when hope seems impossible and defeat seems inevitable, it is sometimes the voice of a single man with conviction and eloquence that can change everything. That is Churchill's true legacy, not the monuments or the titles, but the eternal power of words to illuminate darkness and inspire the human spirit to greatness. Gentle closing, warm call to action. And so we come to the end of Winston Churchill's long journey, from that cold November morning when a boy was born in Blenheim Palace, to that final January day when an old man finally found rest. His story is not simply a story about one man's life, though it is that. It is a story about the nature of greatness, about how greatness is not something you're born with, but something you forge through suffering and struggle and an unwavering commitment to your own vision of what the world could become. Churchill made mistakes. He held views that we now recognize as deeply wrong. He was shaped by the prejudices of his time, and he sometimes failed to transcend those prejudices. Yet he also possessed something rare, the ability to see danger when others were content to ignore it, the courage to speak truth even when truth was unpopular, and the conviction that human civilization was worth fighting for, even at tremendous cost. If these words have carried you toward sleep, If Churchill's journey has unfolded for you like a story that feels familiar and yet somehow new, then this channel has succeeded in what it set out to do. If you found yourself thinking about what greatness means, what it means to persevere in the face of impossible odds, what it means to use your gifts and talents in service of something larger than yourself, then perhaps this story has given you something to contemplate as you drift toward sleep. The history of humanity is ultimately the story of people who chose to act, who chose to speak, who chose to believe that the future could be different from the present. Churchill was one such person. He was not perfect, but he was consequential. He shaped the 20th century in ways that continue to reverberate through our world. And in telling his story, we are really telling the story of what it means to be human, to live with intention, to face the darkness without surrendering to despair. If these explorations of history speak to you, if you find yourself returning to this channel again and again to hear stories of people who changed the world, then consider letting this channel stay with you. Like and subscribe so that others might discover these meditations on history and greatness. And perhaps leave a comment about what aspect of Churchill's life most moved you. What moment in his journey speaks to something in your own experience? Now, as the night grows quiet and sleep beckons, know that you have journeyed through the life of one of history's greatest figures. You have walked with him from the lonely corridors of childhood to the halls of power. You have stood with him in the rubble of bombed cities. You have heard the echo of his words across the decades. And perhaps, in some small way, you have understood something about what it means to persevere, to speak truth, and to believe that individual human effort still matters in shaping the future. Rest well, knowing that Winston Churchill's story continues to echo through time, a reminder that greatness is not something that happens to you, but something that you create through the choices you make and the words you speak. Sleep now, and carry with you the knowledge that history is not something that happened in the past. It is something that is being written right now by all of us, with every choice we make and every word we speak.